for this session. Lynn from USA, France, the tutor for the Center for Psychological Astrology, and her topic is Light and Shadow in the Family.
So, thank you very much again, Gopal, for inviting me, and for all of you for being here and willing to listen to psychological astrology and the tropical zodiac. This is a subject which I've done a lot of work on family patterns and the way that families are put together astrologically. And first of all, I want to say that every family has its own ecology. We have an idea of what a family should be, but families are very rarely conform to this idea. I believe in India, which is a more traditional society where people are closer to family, that perhaps this ideal is more closely represented. Certainly in the West, there's a huge amount of variation. Okay, this is the chart of a young man who has Saturn conjunct the ascendant, square the Sun and Mars in the birth chart. It's not a particularly easy chart. Now, when he was born, his mother felt an instant dislike to him. She could not bear being with him, and although she found this very difficult, she didn't know what to do about it, but she actually felt that she hated this young man. Now, this is not an uncommon experience, although what was uncommon was that people would speak about it, because it's not allowed. A mother should not feel this way about a son. So this young man grew up, and his mother always said, he's so terrible, he's wild. As you can see, he has a conjunction of Uranus, Sun, Mercury, and Mars in Scorpio in the tropical zodiac. And this combination, he had a huge amount of energy. He couldn't sit still. When he was 2 years old, he got in the car and turned on the motor and started driving it away. And so his parents, when they went out with him, they put him on a leash. They literally had a kind of harness for him and attached him because they didn't know how to control him. Now, we can understand that this is an expression of Saturn square Mars, but it's not one any of us would wish to live. I will show you his mother's chart. By the way, he is the eldest son, but the second child. Here is a quote by a Jungian, not by Jung. He says, "There are no shadows in darkness. Shadows are created by light and only exist in the presence of light. Refusing to acknowledge our shadow leads us to deny the presence of light in us." Okay, so this is very important in psychological astrology. If you are in the presence of someone who you dislike, you don't like their voice, you don't like the way they talk, you don't like the way they move, you don't like their mind, it has something to do with you. The shadow experience that you feel, the darkness that you feel, is waking up something in yourself to be worked on. This is Claudia, who works with art therapy, will be talking to us about this kind of thing. This is an image I found on the net of drawings of children and their identity. And here you can see a very different sense of self in these two drawings. Which one would you like to be? Now here is the mother's chart. As you can see, she herself has Saturn and Pluto in the 7th house. Now, in Western astrology, often we talk about the 7th house as the house that's most easily projected. And if you have Saturn and Pluto in the 7th house in your birth chart, you will draw into your life people who will activate your own sense of impossibility, of difficulty. You may feel overwhelmed by the other. it may be that she herself had an experience of rejection or pushback in her own early childhood, which was in fact the case. She in her family was the eldest child, and her mother said that she was difficult and impossible and selfish, all of things which we might associate with Saturn. You can also see that Mars in her chart is opposition Saturn, and you will remember that in her son's chart, Mars was square Saturn. So again, this idea of how do I express Mars when in my own experience, my early experience in my birth chart, I come up against a barrier or the rejection or someone who tells me no, the way that you do things is not allowed, the way the person you are is wrong or bad. There is some kind of judgment for the person that you're meant to be. Now, here are the charts combined, and one of the or put together, not combined or composite. But as you can see, when we put the Saturn of the Sun, which is at 16 Leo, it falls exactly opposite the mother's Mars at 16 degrees of Aquarius. It's within 3 minutes of orb. When you find this kind of precision in a chart, in Western astrology, it sort of locks in. It's almost as if there's an implacability in this relationship. And we might ask ourselves, why would a mother have this kind of son? Why would you attract into your life a person who is going to activate the difficulty that you yourself have felt? Again, if we think in terms of shadow and light, this is the person that her own sense of rejection, she will be asked in this relationship whether she will repeat the rejecting pattern or whether she will be able to step back and stop this compulsion or this pattern that has been deeply rooted in herself. The chances of her being able to step back are slim because the aspect is so precise. But it does not mean, as Dennis just said to us, that they are impossible. This is the work. The work is given to us in the chart. And the darkest shadow in our chart is also the place where the most light can be released. Now, in the case of this mother and son, the son had some difficulty. About 3 months after he was born, she was hospitalized for depression and diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So her son, the birth of this son, revealed a psychological problem, a problem within her own structure. Her son, growing up with this mother who, again, had 3 children, and the youngest was so good, he was so wonderful, he did everything he was supposed to do. But this one was always difficult. It's almost as if she talked about him in a totally different way. What happened is the son, and I'll go back to his chart just for a minute. He ended up a heroin addict for a while, and then he went to jail for a while, and then he got therapy, he got off drugs, he met a woman he loved, and he is a very good husband and a very good father. So he did, in some ways, live out that Saturn in the 12th house, this implacability, but he was not destroyed by it, and he became a very loving man who is in a very loving relationship. Now, we might say this is impossible with this chart, right? And he forgave his mother. He does not hold a grudge against her. So, as you can see, despite the tension, despite the apparent enmity, there was work done between these two individuals. Now, here is another example, it's quite similar. Another way to have shadow in a family, again, this is another mother and son story. You have a child in this drawing who's crowned, who's the prince, who's given all the gifts and all the resources in a family. And we can say it does happen that you have a child who has exceptional intelligence, exceptional artistry. You can see the light in this child. And so it's natural for a family to put their resources in the person who, as Dennis said, has the energy of the god, right? Has the energy of the light. But what happens to the other children in the family? How is it that they keep from feeling that they're unequal in some way or ungifted? That was the preceding example. The shadow, this is from a Jungian named John Conger, comes in the form, I'll just do this, of a thorn in the side, a person or event that appears to block out our expansion, interrupt our joy, and negate our plans. The shadow comes to us in our area of greatest blindness, an area of inferior development where we are least able to defend ourselves, an area where we are least subtle and least able to differentiate. So again, the shadow, the person who represents our shadow, tells us about what we do not have, about what is missing in our own development and in our own psyche. Anton, okay, so again, we have a son. In this case, it's the eldest child and the eldest son, Anton, who is also born with Saturn conjunct the ascendant. And these were a little bit by accident that I chose these examples. They're examples I know very well and people I've known for many years. And so we could say that when you have a child with Saturn on the ascendant, there may be an issue to encounter, Saturn conjunct the ascendant, whether it's in the 12th house or not. There may be an issue about parental authority, about how much you accept of the parent's authority. That can be difficult from the outset. Again, this child is Uranus, Sun, Mercury, Neptune. Uranus and the Sun is between Uranus and Neptune, which creates a great deal of confusion around identity. He too has Mars square, in this case, Mars square Saturn. This is his mother's chart, okay? And this is, again, one of the extreme charts I've encountered with so many planets in the 12th house. Saturn, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Sun, Chiron, and Venus. Of course, in Vedic astrology, they weren't all be in the 12th. And you'll notice she has Moon and Pluto. I've also put in Chiron in the 7th, excuse me, that's not Chiron, that's the Lilith in the 7th house. Now, the story of Natasha is that she was delighted. She was trained as a midwife. She loved being pregnant. She was really looking forward to having her child. She was very excited when he was born and very happy. However, she gave birth under difficult circumstances. Because her husband was not American, they moved to Europe, and she gave birth to her child in a foreign country, far from anyone she knew and far from her own family. And while she was pregnant, her husband was very restless and very nervous about becoming a father and ran away for a while and said that he thought about getting rid of his passport and assuming a new identity so that he didn't have to take on this responsibility. So in some ways, we can see that this, there's a great deal of insecurity in the experience of becoming a mother in Natasha's chart. She's also born on the full moon. After a few years, as her son grew up, she began to feel dislike for him. It wasn't immediate, but she began to feel that he didn't fit the name that she gave him, and she legally applied she changed his name. She said, he isn't the person I thought he was, he's this person. And they went to the judge and got a court and changed his birth certificate. And she began to feel this aversion to him. And he had 2 siblings, and again, this child was a child that she had a great difficulty being around. Now here is the combination of their charts. You will notice they have the moon conjunct, but her moon, Pluto, falls in his 8th house. And one of the ways we can talk about this is that he has no defense against her emotional field. Her psyche, her unconscious, permeates his completely. They also have squares between the charts, but the squares are not as precise or as intense as in the previous chart. What happened is this mother, the family split when this boy was about 15. I'm going to go back to his chart. And the mother was left alone with him in full adolescent crisis. He was setting things on fire, he was climbing on the roofs of buildings, he was talking about suicide. But, in fact, he soon left home, and since then, the mother and son have lived separately on other parts of the planet. She lived in New Zealand, he lived in Europe, she moved to Europe, he moved to China, etc. They cannot be together in some way. What it turns out is the mother had a brother who was very cruel, very difficult, and very sadistic. When this son was born, as he grew, she began to see her brother in him. And you will remember that she has Pluto and the moon and Lilith conjunct in the 7th, very close to the descendant. So she began to see this experience, which she had not eliminated from her own childhood in this son. Her brother, as it turns out, had a brain tumor and died in his early 20s, so his very difficult and cruel behavior may have been an expression of the brain tumor. But nonetheless, whenever her son was aggressive or difficult or demanding, she would have this reaction as if she were with her brother. So this son's only solution was to go very far away so that he was not seen. He did not have to absorb or eat his mother's shadow and become the difficult son. Okay. I don't think I can read. This is an image that actually you put in the magazine, and I liked it so much I put it in my own talk. The next example is about a brother and sister. That's the younger brother, but we won't talk about that. So the next example is about a brother and sister born in a famous family, a French family, and the sister is a sculptor, and her brother is a famous writer and a diplomat. Now, the first child, Henri, was born in 1863 and died at 18 days old. The second child, Camille, was born in 1864. She had a sister named Louise and a brother born in 1968. It's Camille and Louise who both were extremely talented. Camille is a sculptress named Camille Claudel. Some of you may have heard of her. She began to sculpt in clay at the age of 12. And she wanted as you can see, she has Jupiter conjunct the sun in Sagittarius, in the tropical zodiac. And she's born in the 19th century, so it's very unusual for a woman to become a sculptor during this period of time. And yet her father believed very strongly in the talents of his children. She has Jupiter conjunct Sun, her brother has Jupiter trine the Sun. And he believed that both of his children could be exceptional. So when his daughter was 17, she pleaded and begged to be allowed to study with a great sculptor in Paris. And the family moved to Paris so she could do this. And she became apprenticed to Rodin, who was to become the most famous sculptor of his generation. However, she also became his mistress. So she was a young woman at age 17 and became the mistress, the lover of a man who was 24 years older, who also had Jupiter conjunct the sun. As you can see, she has the moon in Aries, conjunct Neptune, trine the sun Jupiter. As a child, she had such a strong personality that she dominated her siblings, who did whatever she wanted. I wrote in my book, Planetary Threads, all brothers and sisters share a common experience for a time, but their talents and abilities are rarely evenly distributed. It may happen that one child carries more of the light than the others, even without seeking to. And for a sibling that follows, it's hard not to be left a larger portion of shadow. I don't know if any of you have had this experience of feeling in a way unseen, unrecognized by your parents, while a sibling is honored and lifted up. And how do you deal with your own feelings of rejection or of feeling less important? This is part of the work we all have to do of eating our shadow, if that happens to us. Now, Camille Claudel was a very extreme temperament. Again, you will notice this is someone who has Pluto conjunct the descendant from the 6th house side. Pluto, opposition the ascendant. And she began to feel, as her own career progressed, I will show you in the next slide some of her work. This is Camille, around the age of 30, in the atelier, sculpting with another woman sculptor, Jessie Limcombe. And I love this image because you can see that there is the invention of the feminine. She is creating herself. She is creating the idea of a woman. It does not fit the model of a woman of her own generation in any way. This is this sculpture she did when she was 20 years old, and it's a portrait of her brother Paul. At some point got pregnant. He didn't want to marry her. We'll go back to her chart. And she had an abortion. When she confessed this to her brother, he believed that she was damned, that she was condemned, that there was no hope for her. Already she was immoral. She came from a bourgeois family, which in France means that you behave as you're meant to behave. But she was a wild woman. You saw the image she was sculpting of the naked woman. She didn't fit with the experiences of her time, and her family was deeply ashamed of her. She began to have some sculptures in exhibitions to get recognition, to get some commissions. And when she did her first sculpture, which I will show you, let's see, I think it's here. This is her first commission for the Museum of Beaux-Arts. And as you can see, there's a woman pleading with a powerful man. When Rodin, her mentor, saw this sculpture, he was horrified that she'd put their relationship in public. He saw that this sculpture was about the woman pleading with the man, and he began to distance himself from her. Camille was left with very little money, very few commissions. Her family was ashamed of her, besides her father. And she became very eccentric, very reclusive, mad. She lived in a small apartment. She barely went out. She would sculpt all year, and in the summer she started to smash her sculptures to pieces. she believed that Rodin wanted to destroy her. Again, all of this is Pluto on the 7th house. She began to see that those who used to love her now wanted to destroy her. The shadow, or the destructive part of her own vision, began to overwhelm the extraordinary creativity of her chart. Again, we'll go back. The extraordinary creativity of her chart, this 5th house moon, Neptune, trine Jupiter, Sun. And shortly after her father died, in 1905, her brother came and had her committed to a mental institution. She was never allowed out of the mental institution, and her mother never came to visit her, and her sister never came to visit her. And she was also sequestered. That meant that she was not allowed communication with the outside world. She wasn't allowed to write. Now again, we see in this chart Saturn in the 12th house. It's a very powerful placement. But the strength of the chart, and Camille Claudel, although she was well known, she was in some museum collections, she never sculpted again. The asylum gave her some clay, but she refused. She said, if I create, they will only come and take my art and steal it from me. So she stopped creating. She was in the asylum for 29 years. And she actually died of starvation during World War II because the Germans who occupied France cut off the food available to prisoners. They had something like 400 calories a day. And her brother came and visited her occasionally, and she would write him letters saying, please let me out. I'm calm now. I won't do anything. But he never allowed her. Even after their mother died, he never wrote and let them leave. Why would her brother not let her out of the asylum? So this is a question. Let's look at Paul's chart. Paul, of course, adored his sister when she was young. They were very close. They adored each other. And yet, he has Venus conjunct Uranus in the 12th house. Now, when I think of this Venus-Uranus, I think of Camille with the image of that sculptor creating the naked woman, the woman who doesn't marry, who lives out her love life, who breaks the rules, and who does things that are not allowed within the law of the family or within the rules of the family. And this Venus and Uranus, which in tropical zodiac is in Cancer, in a way is something he has repressed in himself. When he had his religious conversion, he eventually thought of becoming a monk and going into the monastery. And the priest said, no, you have a career in the world. You're too brilliant, you're too gifted, you should go out. So in some ways, he could have gone into the seclusion of the 12th house. And instead, he put his sister there. He didn't marry for a very long time. He seemed also to be very wary of sexuality. He wrote that he could have, with less good fortune, been exactly like his sister, that it could have been him who ended up fragile and mad and in the mental institution. So one of the ways we can see the shadow in his chart, and what's important here is also the moon in the 8th house in Pisces, square, which is in a difficult relationship to the sun, quincunx the sun, in an 8th house relationship to the sun. You can see that his own emotions are unintegrated, that his own vulnerability is denied, although he was a very gifted writer. And for a while, Paul Claudel was very famous. Now, there's a story. The family didn't talk about Camille. They burnt her letters, although they kept her sculptures. And one day, Paul's granddaughter, he was dead, went to her aunt's apartment and she saw a small bronze. And she said, "What is that?" And the aunt said, "Oh, that's your great aunt's work." She said, "Great aunt?" Because no one spoke of her. She had been disappeared. She was silenced. She was removed from the family history. And this granddaughter then started to do research and ask questions. She found her aunt's sculptures. She found out about her story. And after 20 years, she published a book about her great aunt, Camille Claudel. And then a movie was made about Camille Claudel. This is in 1980. And then Camille suddenly became famous. And now, if you read Wikipedia and you read about Paul Claudel, he's referred to as Camille Claudel's younger brother. So where is the shadow and where is the light? Perhaps one of the issues in this family is that both children had great gifts and they went to war for the light. Paul Claudel spent a lot of time designing his his cemetery marker. He designed a beautiful building with sculptures. He said, "This is where I wanted to be buried." But his sister Camille was buried in a common grave where her bones were mixed with others. And yet, the light of this remarkable, unusual, and difficult woman has outshone the light of her brother. Thank you very much.